Hello and welcome to Weekly MTG, the only show from inside the building, brought to you by the people who make Magic the Gathering. And I've got two such people here today. Michael Majors and Ian Duke are here from the Tabletop Studio to talk all things Pioneer and the Players Tour. We had two pretty exciting events this past weekend. Did you guys get to watch either Nagoya or Brussels?
Yeah, time zones were a little weird, so I kind of caught like some live and then some on the replays. But yeah, it was pretty cool to watch.
Yeah, and then we've got another Players Tour coming up this weekend, Players Tour Phoenix, which you can again watch right here on twitch.tv/magic starting tomorrow, Friday, so that's a 3-day event. But we're going to walk through the events, the top 8 deck lists, a lot more Pioneer talk. We're going to talk about what you guys see happening in Pioneer, your thoughts on the format, and then we're just going to spend the whole time doing that. Sounds like a good time.
Sounds good.
First, couple news items. Steve's not here this week, which means 98% fewer puns. And I do the news. 2 news items for you today. Both things happening this morning, actually. First, we congratulate Seth Manfield on joining Team Envy. If you want to learn more about that, go to envy.gg, or you can check out Seth Manfield's Twitter profile. And then the other thing is we released the MTG Arena State of the Game this morning, which included a pretty cool event for Worlds, where while Worlds is going on, you can actually play in an event with the decks from the 16 competitors. So you can be watching Paulo, VITOR, DAMO, ROSA play against Chris Kavartek, and you can play one of their decks and kind of play along with the weekend, which is really fun and really cool. So you can check out more about that event and the MTG Arena State of the Game on dailymtg.com right now. But now let's get to the meat of it. We're going to talk all about Pioneer. So if you have questions about Pioneer, if you have questions about the Player Tour, put them in chat. I will ask these distinguished gentlemen here what they think, and we'll go from there. So let's start with Players Tour Brussels. Overall, what did you think of, let's start with the top 8.
Yeah, well, super happy overall. There was a great diversity of decks in the event and in the top 8 as well. So that was just wonderful to see. Basically all the macro archetypes, aggro, combo, control, ramp, were represented throughout the tournament. And yeah, it was really a blast to watch.
Okay. Did you guys have a favorite deck in the top 8 at all?
Tough to choose. I'll defer to Michael on that one.
I enjoyed the SULTAI Delirium deck that you all ended up actually taking down the title with. Grindy, traverse the Ulvenwald deck that got to top out with the Uro from Theros Beyond Death. Super exciting new addition to the deck. Gives it both like this kind of graveyard element that is a little bit different, usually these rock style decks, and also some sweet tutor targets. So super fun deck.
Yeah, I'll definitely highlight the Lotus Breach combo deck was definitely an exclamation point for me. Just really cool, unique deck, something we hadn't been able to see before Theros Beyond Death came out, so it was really a blast watching that debut.
Okay, well let's go through the top 8 deck lists, and we're going to start with BANT Spirits. So BANT Spirits might be right. I don't know.
I think you nailed it,
Michael, what do you think about the 2 Brazen Borrowers are the only non-spirits in that list?
So I think the thing to highlight about what Ian was alluding to with Collected Company and the Pioneer format is this is a super powerful card, but when there's a bunch of different types of strategies in a new format, you can't necessarily just show up with a pile of creatures and expect to be able to be covered against every single thing that's out there. So what BANT Spirits is able to do highlighted by a couple copies of Brazen Borrow to round it out, is you have lots of creatures that kind of function like spells. You have Brazen Borrow that offers, kind of this disperse mode so that you can interact with the battlefield. You have Spell Queller to be able to interact on the stack, Mausoleum Wanderer to insulate you from sweepers, Nebelgast Herald lets you stay ahead on the battlefield. So this deck actually has a lot of coverage, even though it's 32 creatures.
Okay. Let's move on to the next archetype because Brussels had all the archetypes. It just the top 8 was really diverse. Next up, we had Mono Red Aggro. So Mono Red was one of the big decks going into this event, but Ian, you were saying beforehand, this one looks a little bit different than we were seeing.
Yeah, that's right. Like, so leading up to the event and before Theros, we were seeing kind of like bigger red decks. People call it chunky red, chonky red, all these kind of silly names for it or whatever. But yeah, going all the way up the curve to things like Glorybringer, for example.
Yep.
But actually what we saw be more successful at Brussels were the mono red decks that kind of came down the curve a little bit and tried to go underneath their opponents, which again makes sense if you're expecting a little bit more of a combo presence in the metagame. You want to really speed yourself up and be faster because, Glorybringer is not really going to deal with Underworld Breach too well or whatever.
Right, and I think another big factor, which we'll certainly spend a lot more time on later, is an Inverter of Truth is just a 6/6 flyer, and Glorybringer just can't do anything about that.
Good point.
That makes sense. So, Michael, what about this deck is attractive to you?
So, number one, great mana base. You're a monocolor deck, so obviously you're super consistent. You see that this deck gets to play Castle Embereth, Mutavault, Ramunap Ruins, so you're getting a lot of equity out of your mana base, in addition to being consistent. Very aggressive curve. You get to interact with your opponent with Wild Slash, Lightning Strike. Weirdly, Wild Slash has kind of like presented itself as one of the best burn spells in Pioneer, which is maybe not something that we expected going in. And then, as you can see on the screen, highlighted by Torbrand, Thane of Redfell, just this super powerful top end that allows you to burst your opponent out of nowhere.
Now talk a little bit, and this is a question for either of you, the choice between playing Goblin Chain Whirler and they're just playing one Mutavault, and you can't really play 4 Chain Whirler, 4 Mutavault, but both are very powerful cards. Why do you think he chose Chain Whirler? Which do you think is a better route to go?
So early on in Pioneer, we've seen lots of really aggressive decks. Not only this mono red deck we've been talking about, but mono black aggro and just various low to the ground strategies. So Chain Whirler gives you, a lot of additional removal spells, so to speak, against those very aggressive decks. Also, just another card that lines up well against these Walking Ballista Heliod combo decks, which again I'm sure we'll talk about soon. But essentially, if your opponent plays turn 2 Walking Ballista for 1 and is trying to set up to combo you out a little bit later in the game, Chain Whirler is another check against that.
Another thing to be thinking about is how many mana elves do you expect? Early on in Pioneer's history, there were a lot of decks that were playing Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves, and Chain Whirler's obviously excellent there. So it kind of it's changed context a little bit. Like early on, it was the anti-mana elf thing, and then those kind of fell out of favor a little bit, and now it's the mono black aggro, anti-mono white type card. So kind of a couple different angles on it.
Makes sense. Let's move on to the next deck. Ian, you said this one was one of your personal favorites. Lotus Breach. So obviously this one is highlighted by Underworld Breach. So this deck, I don't want to say it didn't exist because there was a Lotus deck prior to this, but talk a little bit about how this deck even works.
Oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to defer to Michael.
Oh my gosh, I was really hoping you didn't do that. All right.
We'll piece it together.
So I think actually a very important part of this strategy is the sideboard, which you can see in the creature section, there's 4 Fae of Wishes. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the way you get the Deterministic Kill is to have a Lotus Field with Hidden Strings, and you Fae of Wishes for a Tome Scour.
Yeah, that's correct. You get a Tome Scour, yeah.
And then once you've assembled that combination of cards, and you have an Underworld Breach, you can then Tome Scour yourself at a profit and mill over your entire deck in combination with the aforementioned cards. And then once you've milled your entire deck, you can then play Thassa's Oracle to win the game.
Right. So just to break it down a little bit, so Hidden Strings lets you tap or untap 2 permanents. So once you have a Lotus Field in play, you're actually generating mana by casting Hidden Strings. And then Tome Scour is just for 1 mana milling 5 cards, so that keeps filling up your graveyard. So then you can keep recasting Hidden Strings and Tome Scour with your Underworld Breach. generate mana, go through your entire deck, and as Michael said, yeah, then you can win with Thassa's Oracle from that point.
Now, there were versions of this deck that played Chronic Flooding.
Yep.
What does Chronic Flooding do, Michael?
You're just gonna keep putting me all these pop quizzes. Are gonna happen to me.
Former Grand Prix top 8, in its own day in Standard. It's what 1 aura enchants a land, and when you tap the land, you mill
3.
for 3.
Mill 3, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was meant to be a negative thing you could put on your opponent's lands in Return to Ravnica Limited.
Yes.
Yeah.
quite how it
Pioneer
panned
bringing out some weird ones. Okay. So next, let's move on to a far more explainable deck, Mono Black Aggro. So there are kind of two flavors of Mono Black Aggro in the format right now. There's this, and then there's Vampires, which we'll talk about later. So Michael, talk about the advantages to this version.
Yeah, so kind of similar to Mono Red in a lot of respects. This is a deck that has a really powerful mana base, Mutavault, Castle Lochthwain, or Borg Tomb of Yawgmoth to make your Mutavaults less of a liability for casting your colored spells. And then kind of the key difference between Mono Black and Mono Red in some respects is that you get to play Thoughtseize. And Thoughtseize is one of the pillars of the format, just a super strong disruptive tool against the various combo strategies. The major difference between this Mono Black aggro deck and the Vampires deck is Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. So being able to play Sorin, and especially in combination with Champion of Dusk, allows you to kind of have this draw engine. This Mono Black aggro deck, on the other hand, is more of just, I'm going to play the most efficient, best pound-for-pound cards up the curve.
The other thing I'll highlight about the deck is that it has a lot of staying power. So it can, of course, just win the game early if it gets an aggressive start and can run over the opponent. But then you've also got, if the game goes long or your opponent's killing your creatures, you've got Bloodsoaked Champion, Gutter Bones, Scrapheap Scrounger coming back from the graveyard. You've got Mutavault, so your lands are providing value in the late game. And then Castle Lochthwain is a great way to refuel too. So it's a deck that's capable of winning early but also going long.
Makes sense. All right, next up, we go from one color to all the colors in the hands of Paulo, VITOR, DAMO, ROSA. And by the way, just a side note, there is an article on the front page of Magic.gg right now where Brian David Marshall makes the case that Paulo is the greatest player of all time, which is an interesting argument to be sure, but he's certainly played well in this tournament. He got, I think, 3rd with this list. So that is a lot of lands, a lot of colors. What are we even doing here?
Yeah, I really wouldn't want to write out that deck list for those different types of lands. That was the first thing that jumped out at me. So in some ways, this is kind of a glorified mid-ranger control deck. So Niv Mizzet Reborn is certainly the highlight. It incentivizes you to play lots of different color combinations in your deck. So we've seen tons of different deck lists of Niv Delight throughout the beginning of Pioneer, but Paulo streamlined his deck quite a bit more than some of the lists I've seen out there. You'll notice that he's focusing on more mana acceleration, Sylvan Caryatid, 3 copies of Gilded Goose, some Uros, and then just has kind of a couple of bullets to pair with his Bring to Light, which is the primary way that you actually get your Niv Mizzet Reborn and give yourself some redundancy.
What do you make of the one Thoughtseize?
Are you sure that's not a typo?
I honestly don't know. Do the quick math.
That's a pretty strange one, actually. So typically these decks are playing, like you see the 1 copy of Slaughter Games, which is kind of like the bullet that I'm going to get with my Bring to Light to try to interact with my combo opponent. We've also seen like Unmoored Ego taking up that slot. So I'm going to be honest with you, I don't have a great answer with the thoughts.
Yeah, because most of the singletons are 2-color cards, so they can be found off Niv Mizzet. The exceptions look to be Hour of Devastation and the one Thoughtseize. Maybe he's got more Thoughtseize in the board.
Maybe.
So
I
that was
think
just like
clearly the only explanation is just science.
Science.
Right.
Played
Also,
10,000 games, and this is just the perfect list.
He's Paulo. I'm sure he knows what he's doing. Okay. Next up, actually, the one thing I do want to bring up about this is while Paulo obviously did really well, according to things I read on the internet, so it must be true, the deck actually, this archetype did not do terribly well over the weekend, that it generally had a loose grip.
That's actually true in the tournament. However, we saw this archetype kind of breaking out on Magic Online, I want to say about 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Okay.
And it actually was winning quite a bit there. It was looking like one of the stronger decks, and I remember kind of joking with my coworkers, like, like, hey, like this deck is like looking a little bit scary how much it's winning, but like, what a great deck to be the best deck if it were to be the best deck, right? Like, what a cool format where people are just casting Niv Mizzet Reborn for value and just doing all sorts of cool stuff, playing one of 20 different lands, all these one of non-land cards too. So the deck I ended up not doing super well in the tournament, but I do think it has some staying power in the metagame.
Okay, so let's actually pause on the lists for a second and talk a little bit more about how you've seen Pioneer develop so far, because you said something interesting in there. Pioneer as a format is only a couple months old, and really Pioneer as we know it only got finalized at the beginning of January. So I understand I'm asking you some questions where you don't have a ton of data to back it up, but are you seeing those waves of changes in Pioneer as people discover new cards rather than new things being introduced, or what do you see right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it's a format that's kind of in its infancy right now. We went through this period, for those who are just kind of catching up with the format, we went through a period of, I won't call it like a beta test, but like we were very transparent that we were going to launch the format without a pre-populated band list, and that as we kind of rolled things out, we would let the players figure out, what was too strong and what needed to change. And we went through that period of kind of rapid iteration up through early January, knowing that we would have the Players Tours coming up in early February. And so we kind of expected, even though the changes were slowing down and it was looking like the metagame was settling into place, we hadn't really put that competitive pressure on the format yet. And so we expected that new stuff would break out during these Players Tours. And then also on top of that, we had Theros Beyond Death come out as well, which introduced, we'll get into more details about that later, but introduced a lot of new options and created some new archetypes as well. So I think it's a combination of kind of the first time of putting the really competitive pressure on the format, and also the new cards emerging with Theros.
Okay. Speaking of new cards emerging and competitive pressure, our next deck is DIMIR INVERTER, which is a deck that has garnered a lot of discussion right now.
Absolutely.
We're going to spend more time on it when we get to PT Nagoya. But Michael, what's the basic combination of this deck?
So basically the goal of this deck is that it's a combo deck using Inverter of Truth to exile your entire library except for a small amount of cards that are left in your graveyard, or sometimes very, very few cards if you just cast Dig Through Time. And then once you have a very small library, you either cast Thassa's Oracle or have a Jace Wielder of Mysteries on the battlefield. You intentionally mill yourself out or look at the top cards of your library, which is the rest of your library, and suddenly you've won the game. Congratulations.
And so this is exactly what you had in mind when you guys designed Inverter of Truth, right?
Actually, I did design.
Were you in the building?
Did you really?
Yeah, I led it with the Gatewatch, and I actually did design this card. And I got a lot of comments from people like, what the heck is this card? What am I supposed to do with it? Am I supposed to like beat down with it? Is it some kind of weird combo thing? And I was like, yeah, kind of all of the above. Like, I always thought that it would show up in some context in the grand scheme of Magic. I wasn't sure when, but I guess fast forward how long
Now's
has it
your
been,
time
7
to
years
shine.
or something like that. Yeah.
So what makes this deck? Actually, you know what? We're gonna come back to this because we're gonna talk more about DIMIR INVERTER at Nagoya. Let's move on to the winner, which seemingly out of nowhere, Joel Larsson, who's no stranger to winning these kinds of events, won with not exactly a homebrew, but pretty close. How much SULTAI Delirium were you guys seeing on Magic Online prior to this?
Not a lot. It existed, but
Yeah.
it was just kind of a minor part of the metagame. My understanding is that Joel and a small team of friends all played this deck together, and as a result, because it was a small group of highly skilled players playing it, the deck had a tremendously high win rate at the tournament. We're not necessarily seeing that win rate carry through that high, when we look at like the grander scheme of Magic Online League play or so on, but it is definitely a strong deck, and certainly, Joel, a very strong player as well, so not surprising to see him doing really well with this.
Okay, Michael, tell us what this deck does.
Yeah, so at its heart, this is just kind of the traditional Jund deck, or rock deck sometimes as they're referred to, where it's I'm going to play hyper efficient answers, kind of go 1-for-1 with you, try to stay in the game as long as possible, then pull away with some kind of card advantage engine or some overwhelming threat. So in this case, Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, is both a strong early play. It stabilizes you against aggressive decks, and then later in the game you get to escape it and just pull ahead and take over the game. In addition, you have some Planeswalkers, and then with your Traverse the Ulvenwald tutor package, you're able to find Emrakul the Promised End, which is just the kind of the ultimate trump in a very long game.
Do you expect this deck to have any success this weekend?
It's a good question. It definitely looks solid, and we're seeing it, definitely hanging in the mix in the metagame. So I would expect it to show up. Wouldn't necessarily predict it would win the tournament, but what I love about this deck being a part of the metagame is like it's just like normal Magic, right? It just says like, hey, you can just play normal Magic in Pioneer and be successful, even though there's lots of other things you can do, like be hyper aggressive or play a combo deck or whatever. So it's just kind of representative of this is like all aspects of Magic are viable in Pioneer right now.
Okay. Well, congratulations to Joel Larsson on winning Players Tour Brussels. Let's move on to Players Tour Nagoya, which was a kind of whole different scene. Before we do that, if you have questions for Michael or Ian about anything related to Pioneer or the Players Tour, go ahead and put them in chat. We'll be throwing them out as they come in. So let's talk Nagoya, and let's kick it off with Shota Yasuoka. By the way, this top 8 was stacked.
Super stacked, yeah. I think I recognized every single player's name looking through the top 8. Yeah.
Alicia Tian, like Dmitry Budakov was there. It's just stacked top 8, and Shota Yasuoka, no exception. He was playing the DIMIR Inverter deck that we were just talking about. So there are a couple different flavors of this deck, interestingly, in the top 8 of PT Nagoya. How would you characterize this one?
This deck is so Shota. It just has like these random control elements: one Scarab God, one Ashiok Nightmare Muse, a Languish, because why not? Just these like very small choices that really make it hard for an opponent to play against him.
I wouldn't call this the stock list, definitely. It's like the stock list with like -8 cards and plus a bunch of spicy one-offs, basically. So,
and I think most notably, it's 2 copies of Thassa's Oracle, whereas most of the lists we've seen are playing the full 4. They're kind of functioning as pure combo decks. He's trying to play a longer game. He is trying to put some pressure on you, put you in a squeeze where he's playing a normal control game, and if you let the shields down, he might combo kill you.
Okay. Let's look at another version. Takahashi. I believe was it Yuta Takahashi? I don't remember. Yeah, Yuta Takahashi. So this one looks exactly like the one we saw.
I think that's
GŁOGOWSKI.
True.
It's pretty close to stock. So now let's look at the less stock list. From ISHIMURA, what's going on here, Michael?
Oh man, this one's super cool.
This deck's so sweet. Yeah, kind of like we just spoke about with Shota's deck, where it's like, maybe I'll combo kill you after I play a normal control game. This is like, maybe I'll just pull way ahead with Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, and then instantly I'll kill you with my combo as well.
Yeah, so there's a couple cool things going on here. So Leyline of Anticipation is doing a bunch of different roles in the deck. First of all, it lets you sort of combo at instant speed. Even if you only have 4 lands, you can like end of turn play the Inverter, and then during your upkeep, you can play Thassa's Oracle. That also gives you an angle to evade graveyard removal too, like even if your opponent has a Tormod's Crypt or something like that, because you can play the Oracle during your upkeep. You're never in a window where like you're gonna have 0 cards in your library and have to draw or something along those lines. The other thing it does is it provides 2 blue pips for your Devotion to Blue, which is important then for Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. And if you look at the creatures there, they're very, very heavy in blue mana symbols as well. Not only Thassa's Oracle, but also Merfolk Trickster, Brazen Borrower, Gadwick the Wizened. And so your Nykthos then becomes very powerful, which you can use to fuel a giant Gadwick. So you can actually theoretically like draw most of your deck and then win with Thassa's Oracle that way by having like a very devotion powered Thassa's Oracle. So a lot of different angles that this deck can represent there. Very, very cool.
And you get to play Wizard's Retort, which in this deck looks to be basically counterspell.
Yep, I believe every creature, maybe Merfolk Trickster is not a wizard.
I think Brazen Borrower is not either, but
yes,
a lot of them are wizards.
Yeah. So of the 3, and there were actually more DIMIR Inverter lists in this top 8. First of all, of the 3, which do you like best?
The Devotion deck's definitely the coolest.
Yeah, the Leyline of Anticipation. Yeah.
Which do you think is the best? Like if you were playing in the Players Tour in Phoenix this weekend, which would you choose?
I would probably go with the stock list, to be honest. really a sucker for having easy access to like efficient removal like Fatal Push, Thought Seize, dig through time for card selection. So that's probably the route that I would go.
Okay.
Certainly the list that I think that players preparing for Phoenix were most expecting other players to show up with.
Yep, makes sense. So now there's been a lot of conversation about the DIMIR inverter combo. People are still a little ban trigger happy after how we kicked off the format. We're out of that area where we're just like ban, 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 ban.
Right.
But how do you guys feel about this combo existing right now in the format?
So first of all, I just want to be clear to everybody, don't take anything that I say here as an indication of like, we're planning to ban something or we're not going to ban something or we're signing ourselves up for, we're never going to ban this. Obviously we're going to, just the general statement, forget about this deck. Of course, we're always going to watch how the metagame evolves and we're always going to keep our minds open to make changes if we need to. However, all that being said, this is a new breakout deck that's just come out over the last couple weeks. To me, it looks really cool. It's doing a unique thing that other decks haven't been doing in the environment. And having looked a little bit at the data here, it looks like it has a balance of strong and weak matchups against the other top decks. So it looks like something that could integrate itself just fine into the metagame, and have natural counters to it and such. So it's nothing alarming to us yet from this standpoint. And most of all, it's just like exciting and cool to see a new deck break out.
It is essentially a two-card combo, Inverter of Truth and Thassa's Oracle. But how do you guys view this as being different from some of the other two-card combos that have been banned, like Saheeli, Felidar?
Yeah, a lot of people like to make generalizations of like a two-card combo that wins from hand, must be ban-worthy. We don't, that's not how we balance the game or view the game here. We don't make generalizations like that. We're always looking at a variety of different factors like, how strong is the deck? How often does it win? Does it have other bad matchups in the meta game? How fast is the deck, right? Like if you wanted to just race it by playing an aggressive creature deck, can you beat it before it can combo off? How interactable is the combo, right? Combos that are interactable through decks or through cards that other decks normally play, like creature removal spells or counter spells, or hand disruption spells, are a lot more likely to be tolerable in the metagame in the sense that other decks can naturally adapt to counter them versus other examples of combos that might be harder to interact with through normal means. So we're factoring all of that stuff in and watching the metagame evolve when we're making decisions about, do we need to take B&R action against a deck like that. All that being said, I think it's perfectly healthy for there to be some combo in an environment like Pioneer. Part of what makes Magic so deep is that, sure, you can play a normal creature deck and attack, or you can play a control deck, or you can play a deck that wins through other more creative means. And this is just an example of, an alternative win condition that you can build around. And I think it adds, flavor and excitement to the metagame generally.
Michael, how would you expect players to prepare for this deck this weekend?
So I think we might see more uptick in cards like Thoughtseize or Duress or other various ways to interact with any generic combo deck throughout the history of Magic. Also, ways to interact with Planeswalkers. I think a notable difference, Ian said things very well, but is that this isn't necessarily a combo where I assemble my two pieces and the game is over instantly on the spot every time. Inverter of Truth does shuffle your graveyard into your deck, so if you have had any interaction up to that point, you still have to deal with some size of a library. Notably, if you have a 0-card library and a Thassa's Oracle and you kill it, you still do win the game, but it's pretty difficult to get to that point, especially very early in the game. So, it's not like a situation where it's like, I've assembled my 2-card combination, the game is instantly over no matter what. So cards like Hero's Downfall, I think, would be, we're going to see more so this weekend in Phoenix. Counter spells are always a pretty viable option against these types of strategies, so we might see an uptick in like blue-white control or other strategies that have been popular historically like that. And again, I think typically what you see with different types of decks like this is over time they actually become less dedicated combo decks and kind of merge into mid-range or control decks that incorporate this combo. So it's not true that every game is ending in a very abrupt, quick fashion on turn 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, well, and I think we've already seen that in, we've seen some Sultai versions of the inverter combo showing up, where they've kind of mashed together Yoel Larsson's deck and the DIMIR inverter combo, and they've come up with, I think, Sam Black might have had an article about it today on Star City Games, but we've seen a couple lists floating around. Do you expect that that's the direction some people might go as well?
It's interesting. I think that's definitely a possible evolution of the deck. I believe that deck also utilizes Euro as kind of this, like, I can maybe, again, put some pressure on you, gain some card advantage. You have to deal with my plan B, and then suddenly I can combo kill you. Also, it has the benefit of playing some acceleration, I think, which is always strong in combo decks like this. But that being said, the more less focused your deck is, then perhaps the more susceptible you are to very pinpoint targeted hate.
Yeah. Well, and Uro is interesting to me because it's another way to remove cards from your graveyard, too.
Yep, also a great point.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the most out of left field deck this weekend, by far, SRAM Auras, which Ken YUKUHIRO, another ringer, yeah, this deck happened. What?
Notably a ringer with off the beaten path strategies.
Yeah, very true. So, Michael, how were you describing this deck earlier?
I think I said it looked like an old block constructed deck with maybe some help in the mana base department.
Yeah, it's actually amazing how many of these cards come from Theros Beyond Death. It's like almost half the deck. So yeah, this was a big surprise for us to see. It looks super cool. You know, it's in the style of like the Slippery Bogle deck that was a thing in Modern, or has been a thing in Modern for quite some time. But obviously, not really using the hexproof here so much. So it's like non-slippery Bogles, I guess. I'm not really sure here, but anyway,
very catchable.
Loading up a bunch of enchantments on like a life-linking creature in particular. Very effective against other aggressive decks or catching decks that can't remove it very easily, or getting out of range of mono red burn, for example. Seems like it could be well positioned in the metagame.
And strangely, it's almost like an engine deck. You can see SRAM Senior Edificer up here on the screen, but also Hateful Eidolon, a card from Theros Beyond Death, is another piece that allows you to draw cards when creatures with auras on them die. So you're not actually going as all in as you would expect in a deck like this at first glance.
Well, in Hateful Eidolon, what I like about this deck is a lot of the cards play double duty. As like Ian, you were talking about earlier, putting it on a lifelink creature. Hateful Eidolon's both an engine and a lifelink creature. I'm going to pronounce this
Alseid?
wrong. Alseid of Life's Bounty can protect your Aurored up creatures and also can be that creature with lifelink.
Right. So yeah, a lot of different angles here. Yeah, that's a great point. The double duty of each of the creatures here is really phenomenal.
And then you've got the All That Glitters, that is kind of your cranial plating of the enchantment deck. So, okay, really cool, wild deck. Next up, DMITRY BUTAKOV came in and played Mono Black Vampires. So this was the other flavor of Mono Black that we were talking about. Michael, what is the main differences between this and the other Mono Black deck?
Yeah, we touched upon this earlier, but I think the key pieces are Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, very powerful planeswalker. It allows you to buff up your various vampires in your deck. But notably, the -3 allows you to put Champion of the Dusk onto the battlefield as early as turn 3. That allows you to draw some cards, play this really powerful 5-drop ahead of schedule. And then otherwise, not a ton different between this and the Mono Black deck. Your curve is a little bit higher, your cards are maybe a little bit higher impact. You have Kalida's Trader of Get, which is super strong card against other aggressive strategies, but still, at the end of the day, you're playing Thoughtseize Fatal Push, have a really strong mana base.
Okay. Yeah, Ian, talk a little bit about that core of Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Castle Lockthwaite, and Mutavault, because we see a lot of lists have success with, centered around those 4 cards.
Yeah, so certainly Thoughtseize and Fatal Push are just 2 of the most efficient answers or ways to disrupt your opponent in the environment. Both 1-mana spells, Fatal Push in particular, able to pick off, everything from Mana Elves to help defend you against other aggressive decks to, breaking up a Walking Ballista combo, things along those lines. And then Thoughtseize, of course, a powerful weapon against some of the new combo decks that have broken out, as well as just being a great disruptive tool in general. Then we get to the mana-based elements here, and this is something that I think players can often overlook because it feels really subtle. It's okay, they're just lands here, but they actually give you Mutavault and Castle Lockthwaite give you a very robust late game in terms of being able to refill your hand or put some additional pressure on your opponent. Mutavault in particular, living through sweepers like Supreme Verdict. And able to finish off your opponent if they're at a low life total. So it really adds like another dimension to the deck beyond just the non-land cards that are contributing.
Okay. And then finally, last and certainly not least, because it won the tournament, we have another BANT Spirits list, which is going to look very similar to the last one.
Yeah, we've seen this before.
Yep. We have. It is not identical, but it's pretty darn close. I think the number of selfless spirits was slightly different in the other list. Michael, is there any other way to build this list, or is this kind of where you want to start if you're a spirits player?
It's definitely where I would start, but I think it would be foolish to say that this is the end point of the BANT Spirit strategy. Right, just because a deck list performed really well last weekend with 32 creatures doesn't necessarily mean that like I would want to sign myself up for playing no creature spells except for Collected Company. We've also seen various both Spirit strategies and Collected Company strategies pop up in the early days of Pioneer. So, I mean, there's definitely something here. The core is certainly strong, but I'm sure there's innovation to be had.
Yeah, I think that the jury's still out on whether the Collected Company splash is worth it here. Another direction I could see taking this deck, especially if combo remains a strong presence, is just going blue-white without Collected Company, and then adding some other non-creature spells, you know, things along the lines of Spell Pierce or other counter magic, you know, could kind of interact with the stack more, as Michael put it earlier. Which of those paths is better? I'm not sure yet. I don't think anybody's sure yet. We'll see how the metagame continues to play out. But I think, yeah, there's the potential for kind of a fork there.
Okay, so KENTA won this event. The BANT Spirits list in Brussels didn't make it out of the first round of the top 8. Obviously, there's some variance there. But why do you think KENTA had more success in his top 8 with Spirits?
Honestly, it could be because it was a more combo-heavy top 8. Definitely, like Spell Queller, you know, being I think one of the all-stars here in terms of being able to, you know, defend yourself while putting on pressure. I forget exactly how the brackets played out, but that would be my bet for why he was successful there.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. On its face, it looks like the Spirits deck is really well equipped to handle various combo strategies. So that means we might see a lot of it this weekend in Phoenix.
Okay, and I do want to call out. We weren't showing off sideboards there, but KENTA had a weird, what looked weird at first glance, card in the sideboard, Permeating Mass. Michael, what does this card do? We're gonna put it up on the screen.
Thank you.
We had to look this one up before.
Yeah, so well. It's a 1/3 for 1 green mana, which is, I mean, 1/3 for 1 green is cheap. It is a spirit.
That was a surprise to us.
That was yeah, we didn't. And whenever Permeating Mass deals combat damage to a creature, that creature becomes a copy of Permeating Mass. What would you use this card against?
So this is a 1 mana 1/3. So my mind immediately goes to like this is a strong roadblock against aggressive strategies. Also, presumably, you're not bringing it against other Spirits decks, so you have a Permeating Mass that's maybe a 2/4 or a 3/5, and then suddenly your opponent just can't really block it because then it'll just kill whatever is blocking it.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, when I first saw the stats 1/3, I immediately thought back to the mono black aggro deck we talked about earlier, which has just loads and loads of 1 mana 2/1s, you know, Gutter Bones, Blood Soaked Champion, and stuff like that. So it's just an excellent blocker there, I think, against mono red and mono black.
Okay. Also, it's pretty funny when it blocks Immutable. I have no idea what happens at that point, but at end of turn when we, yeah, I don't know. Judge.
Yeah, I'm rusty on my Mutable Judge rulings.
So that covers the 2 top 8s, but that doesn't cover all of Pioneer. So let's talk about a few other deck archetypes. And chat, if there are other archetypes that you want to get their take on, feel free to throw them in chat and we will cover them. But let's start with one archetype that got a lot of talk coming into the weekend because of another 2-card combo, Heliod and Walking Ballista, Mono White Devotion.
Yeah, so this is so Mono White Devotion. You know, basically just your classic like white weedy deck with a heavy emphasis on getting lots of white pips for Devotion, able to turn on Heliod there, and then at the point where you have Heliod in your deck, throwing in the Walking Ballista combo is kind of a free roll at that point. So it's kind of like plan A is just be an aggressive, you know, play to the board creature deck, try to run over your opponent, and then plan B is maybe, you know, if you catch your opponent tapped out or whatever, you can go for the combo.
Okay. Michael, the Heliod Ballista combo can go in a lot of decks because it really only requires 1 white mana. Do you think this is the best implementation of it?
It's hard to say. Like you said, because it's actually a relatively low investment to incorporate the combo in your deck, since one of the pieces is colorless and then you only need 1 white pip. I think this is another situation where we might see the format evolve dramatically, maybe decks are including, 3 or 4 copies of Walking Ballista because it's just a generically strong card that you might want in your deck, but at that point maybe you can just play 1 Heliod or 2 Heliod. So again, I think it's a situation where like you might see the format evolve to the point where the Heliod Walking Ballista combo is not the central piece of the deck, but we're seeing multiple decks try to incorporate it.
Next up, let's talk about. We'll get to some of Chad's decks in a second. Let's talk about Azorius Control. So Azorius Control has had a lot of flavors. It's kind of always been there once we got through the initial wave of bannings for Pioneer. Where do you view Azorius Control's place in the metagame?
Well, again, certainly, if combo is on the rise here, having access to counter spells is definitely a great angle to go. We also saw a number of just aggressive decks like mono black aggro, mono red, and even spirits to some extent. So a card like Supreme Verdict can be really valuable there. So I think, much like how mono red is just an archetype that everybody tries in every format, blue-white control is just a natural archetype to try in every format, and I think there's lots of ways to build it, and it's ultimately going to really depend on what way the metagame goes, is going to determine how you end up building your control decks.
Okay. What strengths does Azorius Control have to lean into?
Like Ian alluded to, just having access to counter spells makes it have an angle against these combo decks. Being able to play sweepers like Supreme Verdict or Settle the Wreckage, strong against the aggressive strategies. And then just having some of the strongest planeswalkers in the format is definitely a huge boon to the deck. Having Teferi Time Raveler if people are trying to get cute and play like Leyline of Anticipation or more uptick in collected companies means that your opponent has to play Sorcery Speed. Teferi Hero Dominaria, just one of the most powerful planeswalkers, is a really great way for the deck to close out. Also a deck that has a strong mana base between Castle Ardenvale, Castle Vantress. You were talking about the Gaia Reach Sanitarium, Narset Parter Veils combination earlier.
Yeah, so the way that one works, I watched someone do it in FNM the other week, is if you have Teferi, Narset, and a Gaia's Reach Sanitarium, I could not for the life of me figure out why Gaia's Reach Sanitarium was in so many of these lists for a while. And then I saw him doing it, I was like, oh, okay. So if you have those 3 pieces out, in your opponent's draw step, after they draw, you can activate Gaia's Reach Sanitarium, so they cannot draw a second card, and they must discard the card they drew. And Teferi prevents them from playing instants, and it's a lock, and it's...
Sounds like a miserable way to go.
I mean, or you just like, oh yeah, I see, I can't win, and then you concede.
Sure.
One of the two. But I don't actually know if that was being played in this past weekend. Let's move to, Chat has a couple archetypes they want you guys' opinions on. Arclight Phoenix decks.
Yeah, so I think these types of decks are super beloved, where it's like I'm going to play cheap interaction, tons of cantrips, just kind of blaze through my deck and then find some way to kill you. In this case, it's Arclight Phoenix. My instinct is that Arclight Phoenix would be one of the best Treasure Cruise decks in the format, especially early on, and we just haven't seen it pan out that way.
Yeah, we did see a lot of experimentation with these style of decks early on in Pioneer's history. From what I've seen looking at the data, these type of archetypes have always been disproportionately popular relative to how much they win. Not to say it's a bad archetype by any means, but just like people really seem to latch onto it like that style of deck. So I definitely expect it to be a deck that people continue to experiment with. And it's also the kind of deck that as new cards are added to the pool, it's a deck that is likely to power up just right as there's more options for cheap cantrips and ways to fill your graveyard and things like that. So I would expect it to have some staying power in the metagame going along.
I have 2 Pioneer decks built. One of them is Blue-White Control, and one of them is Phoenix.
Ah, wonderful. Nice.
And I do, discovering the interaction, it's not that amazing interaction, but plans. Look at the top 3. Strategic planning, yeah. Strategic planning, that Arclight Phoenix and Treasure Cruise was actually just a delight.
Oh yeah, super fun to play, super fun.
Yeah, the deck has some issues, but it's so fun to play Ancestral Recall in a format like that. And then another archetype that they wanted to hear about was Simic Ramp.
So yeah, Simic Ramp, obviously, ramp decks in general were really popular early on in Pioneer's history. Of course, as we went through the initial populating the banned list and that rapid iteration period, some of the cards that were popular in those ramp decks, ultimately had to go. Oko and Oath of Nissa, Once Upon a Time, etc. But I think with the addition of Uro and some other new options in Theros Beyond Death, I can definitely see ramp coming back and just kind of being a more like kind of going over the top of some of the other mid-range decks. If something like SULTAI Delirium ends up being like a major staple in the metagame, I could see the ramp decks like kind of trying to go over the top of that as that being their role in the metagame. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I think the core of Uro, Nissa Who Shakes the World, and Hydra Grace is just this strong, robust payoff package, and then just incorporating some mana creatures, maybe some interaction, and then some additional building blocks is definitely a good way to, like Ian said, go over the top of traditional mid-range decks.
Yeah, I know we saw on camera this past weekend there were some Ugins, there were a few Eldrazi at the top end. It definitely got played. Did not quite make the final rounds. One deck that did pretty well, but also did not make the final rounds, was Is It in Soul, which seems like a strong archetype. What are your thoughts?
This deck's always been kind of like just under the radar in terms of popularity in the metagame, but it has been something that people have been playing on and off for all of Pioneer's history so far. Definitely a deck that warms my heart to see. Reminds me a lot of what I think Mike Sigrist played at Pro Tour Origins way back, which I casted, and that was really entertaining to watch. But yeah, just these like kind of artifact-y based aggressive decks trying to go all in with Ensoul Artifact early in the game. It's definitely puts a lot of pressure on the opponent, and if people are unprepared for it, can definitely catch them with their pants down, so to speak.
Yeah, it definitely strikes me as one of the sleeper decks in the format. And also, I think next to Spirits, maybe one of the better choices against like a combo meta game between a Quick Clock, access to Metallic Rebuke, and Stubborn Denial. That's some really good piece of interaction to deal with any combo strategies.
Okay, which makes sense. Let's see. Chat also wanted to know. I haven't seen it, but you look at a lot more data than I have. So have you seen any green stompy decks?
We have, yeah. There was a period of time when basically just mostly green stompy decks with sometimes splashing a little bit of blue for Stubborn Denial, I think, were pretty popular there and doing pretty decently. They've fallen out of favor a little bit in the recent weeks, but based on how it was looking in the past, I could definitely see that reemerging again. Yeah.
Okay. What are the strengths of a green stompy deck, Michael?
Mostly that you get to leverage larger creatures than other beatdown decks. So whereas your mono black or mono red opponent's playing 2/1s, or maybe they top it at 3/3s, you're playing 5/4s on turn 2. So you kind of get to outmuscle the aggressive decks.
Yeah, you're basically giving up on like the burn to finish out the game that mono red would have, or the kind of resilience that mono black has with, we talked about its mana based and its recursive creatures, giving up on those in exchange for your creatures are just bigger than your opponent's creatures. So it's something that I see maybe being strong in the aggro versus aggro mirror matches. So if the metagame goes in a direction where mono black and mono red continue to be popular, I could see mono green kind of rising up as a counter to that.
Okay. Michael, if you were playing this weekend,
Oh, no.
we're not allowed, but if you were playing this weekend, what would you play in Phoenix?
Maybe Sultai Delirium. I like decks like that. That's if I wasn't rusty. I'd probably pick like a very aggressive deck now, or maybe if I had been playing with the Is It in Soul deck early on in Pioneer, that's again a choice I would gravitate towards because of its aggressive nature plus having some interaction.
Okay. Ian?
I think, yeah, again, like Michael said, my rusty and realistic choice, probably I would go for like mono black aggro. I've always loved playing the color black in Magic, and particularly aggressive black decks. So that's kind of like, would be my personal favorite choice. Beyond that, maybe I'd be interested in trying DIMIR Inverter. Seems like it has a lot of options in terms of card selection and access to disruptive elements like Thoughtseize and Fatal Push. So that could be a good mix also.
Okay. Before we go, I want to ask you guys kind of a couple general questions about Pioneer. Where do you see Pioneer's place in the giant sphere that is Magic compared to Modern?
Yeah, great question. So kind of going back to Modern's inception, Modern was introduced kind of just before my time here at Wizards, and when I came in, I was sort of talking to some folks and asking about kind of what they saw as the purpose of Modern. So when Modern was first created, the idea was it would be a place where when your cards rotated out of Standard, you could take that deck and maybe upgrade it a little bit and play with it in Modern, and it would be somewhat competitive. But through Modern's nature as a non-rotating format, as more and more cards have been added to that pool, over time, it's kind of the gap between the power level of Standard and the power level of Modern has kind of drifted apart there. And so after enough time had passed, we kind of saw an opportunity for inserting something in the middle that's kind of like not as deep not to say that the card pool in Modern is more powerful, but by the nature of having a larger and larger card pool, the format tends to get more powerful. So kind of inserting something in between where Standard is and where Modern is, that's kind of more scratching that itch that Modern did early in its life cycle, if that sort of makes sense. Now, all that being said, we still love what Modern is doing for the Magic community. Super popular format, super awesome format, super fun. And we want to make sure everybody knows that we're going to be continuing to support Modern just as we always have. No changes there. Pioneer is not meant to be a new Modern or to eclipse Modern or replace Modern in any way. It's just that we saw a new slot in the ecosystem where all three of Standard, Pioneer, and Modern can now coexist and be fully supported.
Okay. You guys kind of touched on this earlier, but what do you view the role of combo in Modern? A lot of players see combo as kind of a dirty word, but do you view it as like a healthy part of the metagame, something to watch? How do you view it?
Healthy in moderation, certainly. I think combo is a part of Magic. It's a part of what makes Magic fun, as I was alluding to earlier. Part of what makes Magic so deep is that there are other ways to play, other things to build around besides just straightforward attacking with creatures, playing proactively kind of thing. That being said, combo can also be dangerous in terms of metagame health. I think it's probably no surprise to anybody that combo cards more often end up on the banned list after a period of time. And the reason for that is because combos often can be harder to interact with. Either they can win from an empty board in one turn, which can be difficult for some decks to interact with, or just depending on how sort of out there the combo is, normal tools that decks normally need to play against each other aren't effective against the combo decks then, which can make them harder to counter. The other way that combo can be unhealthy for a metagame is if it's just too fast. We generally don't like when combo decks can just outrace the aggressive decks, because then you have potentially a win condition that's both difficult to interact with and also faster than the other options to win with, and that can be a dangerous territory to get into. But as I said earlier, we don't make generalizations. A lot of people like to make statements like 2-card combos that can win from the hand are just wrong or dangerous or should be banned or whatever. We don't make clear-cut blanket generalizations like that. Again, it always comes down to how winning is the deck, how easy is it to interact with, how fast is it, and so on and so on. And we want to look at all these things as well as its place in the metagame and whether it has other matchups that it's weak to. So kind of looking at all the angles there and looking at the big picture.
Okay. Do you guys have, and Michael, I know you did a lot of the original exploration of kind of what Pioneer is. Do you guys have any hidden gems in the format that you're like, I thought this might break out, but no one's seen it yet? For example, Permeating Mass.
No, Permeating Mass is certainly not
Hidden
very
gem, Permeating Mass.
I remember when we were doing some of the initial research about, as Ian alluded to, trying to strike the balance between we want the format to be robust enough that it's not immediately solved, or it isn't too much like Standard, but there's still room for Standard cards to enter the card pool naturally as rotation occurs, and for also there to be room for the format to grow. I made some passes of various files throughout Magic's history and kind of divided them into various subcategories, and powerful synergy cards, powerful just generic great cards, etc. So there's certainly a few cards that kind of missed my expectations. Like Emrakul the Promised End, even though it actually just won the Pro Tour, is I think it's one of the first times that I've seen that card show up. Whereas I expected to be a big player. Historically strong Standard cards like Aetherworks Marvel is certainly something that we thought might show up because it just has had such a strong showing historically. But yeah, there's been a lot of surprising stuff, and I think Pioneer's going to continue to be really fun to watch and play.
All right. Well, if you want to watch more Pioneer action, see how I did that? That was
Well
good.
done.
That was good transition.
Yeah.
You threw that one up there for me. If you want to watch more Pioneer action, tomorrow, right here on twitch.tv/magic, we have Players Tour Phoenix, which is the final Players Tour in Players Tour Series 1. This one's happening in the Americas. There's going to be a ton of great players there. So definitely tune in tomorrow, Saturday, and Sunday for both draft and Pioneer action from the Players Tour. Otherwise, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ian, for coming in and talking Pioneer with us and talking with all of you fine people. Thank you for joining us. We are off next week for the World Championship because I'm going to be on a plane to Hawaii. And so we will see you the week after on the 20th, where we're going to talk about a new product. Ooh,
Cool.
Yeah. That's a cool one. So we will see you back here on 220, or tune in tomorrow. Oh, and do both. Tune in tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday, for the Players Tour from Phoenix. Thank you, and have a good